Hello everybody, it's me, Fee, White Zulu, and welcome to my YouTube channel. This is a little bit more from my autobiography, White Zulu, and this is White Zulu Chapter 8, More Pests. I must explain before I start that since this book was written about the 1950s onwards, some of the terms like, and I quote, houseboy, were all normal in those times. I understand that 70 years later, these terms are unacceptable in post-1994 South Africa. But since this is a historical book of those times, these now derogatory terms are not intended to offend in any way at all. So here we start. Years later, this follows on from the baboons story. In 1988, I had become secretary of the Zululand Bird Club, a bird watching society, and in order to engage with Dad, I worked very hard to raise his interest in bird identification, as we had a plethora of often rare species all over the ranch. To help him get to know our multitude of garden birds, my two young sons made him a wooden bird table, which we hung from the tree directly outside the glazine, meaning glassed-in veranda, where, from the comfort of his favorite armchair, he could see every avian visitor. This was a resounding success, so much so that even Dad started putting out food for the birds himself instead of getting the servants to do it. This was too much for Mum because it attracted even more pesky birds to the garden to nip the buds off her flowers. So, instead of allowing her aging husband this pleasurable little hobby, she had her garden Zulu, Jomela, make a trap out of chicken wire, a cunningly clever thing which the birds could creep into but not out. She not only carefully placed the trap on the bird feeding table, but paid her 3 gardening women 50 cents per carcass to wring the necks of the captives. Every unfortunate little bird which went into that trap, excuse me, I've had a cold and I can't shake it, excuse me, came to a sticky end. Sorry. I really apologize for that. I remember seeing dead white eyes, mouse birds, as well as so many other pretty little finches and rare sparrows, their corpses all laid out neatly in a row on the huge wooden table, excuse me, on the back veranda, which we called the polo ground. They'd been carefully put there so that Mum, excuse me, Mum could count them and pay up. She was unstoppable. It was only the baboons that got the measure of her. They seemed to take endless pleasure in their systematic raids on Mum's vegetables, the orchard, and the berries on her ornamental fruit trees. She even went so far as to plant her pumpkin seeds in among the rose bushes to try and fool them. I went along the back veranda one morning on my way to breakfast. There, laid out in rows on the same table, were about 9 big but not quite ripe pumpkins, which Fiona had harvested that morning. Fiona came to me quietly and with her finger to her lips said, "Come and look." She lifted them up and showed me the one single but enormous bite taken out from each one. I knew immediately what had happened, but when I got to the breakfast table there was only Dad eating his porridge. I looked at him, and before I could say anything he said, "Have you seen the pumpkins?" I nodded. "Well, your mother hasn't, and don't say a word. I want to see her face when she sees that lot." We sat eating, while Mum did her usual performance of rushing around with a piece of toast in one hand, a coffee cup in the other, hunting for her reading glasses so that she could make a shopping list. She never actually sat down to breakfast. Our system of grocery shopping was rather haphazard. If anyone was going to be driving the 20 miles into Nottingham Road, Mum would ring up Hewson's, the Indian general dealer, on our party telephone line shared by 11 other farms, and place an order, which would be collected along with our post and the newspaper. This involved Mum impatiently snatching up the phone receiver at intervals, only to find somebody already talking. She'd curse and storm off to the pantry to add items to her list. Eventually, she would find the line free and place her order. By this time, she would be in a towering rage and would return to the breakfast table to dump her coffee cup. This was the moment Dad chose to tell her to go and look at the back veranda. We both sat there and waited until we heard the inevitable eruption from the back and Mum yelling at the gardening women to go and pick every single pumpkin that is left in the entire garden now and put them all on the roof of the back veranda where the baboons can't get at them, while he and I wiped tears of laughter from our eyes with the table napkins. Apart from the baboons, there were the porcupines, which paid nocturnal visits to the garden and dug up and ate the roots of our dahlias. She set the same cage trap as she'd used for the baboons and regularly caught one. She told Dad to shoot the trapped porcupine and he agreed, but secretly he asked the farm workers to load the cage onto the back of his Land Rover. He drove to the furthest boundary of the farm and released the porcupine. Next night there was one in the trap again, quite possibly the same animal, and the process was repeated. Bush pigs were another bane of Mum's life. These, also nocturnal, came into the garden and rooted up her bulbs, causing havoc, as only bush pigs can. She set the trap and caught one. Unfortunately, the trap was too flimsy for a bush pig, as it's the size of a wild boar and very strong. This bush pig galloped off, wearing the trap like an Elizabethan frilled collar, and finally dumped his annoying accessory into the river as he waded across and blundered into the forest. Bushbuck, those large, graceful nocturnal antelope with their spiraled trophy horns, loved to nibble the new shoots off Mum's roses. At vast expense and effort, she had the fence raised around her 5 acres of garden, only to find that the buck cleared 7 feet with ease. She then tried various other deterrents, including lion dung, got from the lion park just outside of Maritzburg, as well as human hair swept from the floor of Knott's, the small hairdressing salon in the village. She festooned fishing line hung with empty beer cans to frighten them off at night, but to no avail. Smaller, dainty little grey duiker, another antelope, also jumped the fence and ate whatever the bushbuck had overlooked. All year round, even when we couldn't see them, we'd hear the adult bushbuck's loud alarm calls, which sounded like dogs barking. Even Dad would sometimes be fooled by the barking and mutter to himself about "those bloody munt dogs are hunting in the bush again," as he picked up his old R303 British Army issue rifle and some bullets to go after them. Then he'd listen again, or one of us would point out, "It's only Ngonga, Dad." And somehow somewhat reluctantly, he'd put away his weapon. A troop of vervet monkeys executed the occasional raid on the vegetable garden whenever the baboons were otherwise occupied. She blazed away at these with the 410 shotgun loaded with birdshot, with the same amount of success as she'd had with the baboons. The wily monkeys were even harder to stalk and would leap chattering onto the treetops to mock her. Moles, which excavated her sweeping lawns, were attacked by Mum driving the Land Rover onto the grass, attaching a hose pipe to the exhaust, and trying to asphyxiate the burrowing animals by sticking the other end down one mole hole after having blocked all the other holes. She also poked smoke bombs down the holes and tried to flush them out with the garden hose. Nothing worked. In spite of the fact that we lived on a cattle and sheep ranch, Mum treated all animals with suspicion. She refused to have any cattle near the house, as she couldn't stand the noise of their bellowing at night, and there was always the chance that they would jump over the cattle grid and into her garden. This did occasionally happen, and there were wails of despair as she found hoof prints 8 inches deep on the grass tennis court. Horses were another threat, and they had to be pastured as far away as possible. This created problems for us, as we had to walk so far to catch them, and then had to bring them back to the tack room to saddle up. The farm dogs weren't allowed in the house, neither were any cats. There were stable cats, semi-wild creatures, which lived in the sheds and kept the rat population down. But we also had our own beloved pet cats given to us as kittens by Grandpa. If we wanted to play with them or let them sleep on our beds, we had to smuggle them through the big sash windows into our bedrooms. Now that's just behind me in the photograph of the bedroom side of our house, and how close it is to that indigenous bush. Routines and rituals. Mum barely tolerated us in the house. On the rare occasions that the weather was wet and we were allowed indoors during the daytime, we had to play in the nursery where we ate all our meals. As we grew older, Mum grudgingly permitted us to sit in the armchairs in the glassine, but yelled at us if we dared put our bare feet on the covers. I remember many occasions when I would be curled up, happily absorbed in a good book, to find Mum bearing down on me with a fly swatter, shouting, "Get your filthy feet off my covers!" Every waking hour and unhindered by domestic chores, because she had a full-time Zulu chef, a houseboy who did all the housework, maids to do the laundry and work in the garden, as well as nannies to look after the children. Mum was always on the warpath over one thing or another. She even raged over the weather, trying to control the elements. Being a perfectionist, she would have the garden looking immaculate, and then, as storm clouds darkened the sky and the first rumble of thunder rattled the windows, she would frantically pace the veranda, throwing salt out of the doors, according to the Zulu superstition that it prevents hail, all the time muttering furiously about all her hard work that was about to be destroyed. Dad had obsessions too, or rather delusions. He and Mum were convinced that they were superior in breeding and education and class to practically everybody on the planet. They cut themselves, and as a result, their 4 daughters, off from everybody in the neighbourhood. After leaving his private boarding school, Michael House in Belgaum in the Dargle, Dad had spent 3 years at Cambridge University in England, doing a rather ordinary agricultural degree. As her only son, his mother indulged him and arranged for unlimited funds to be sent to him, enabling him to buy a car and travel extensively while he was there. He mixed with other privileged young rakes, and then when he came back to South Africa, was under the impression that he was the equivalent of an upper-class English gentleman surrounded by colonials. Dad didn't like women particularly, and all his life he constantly bemoaned the travesty which had allowed women into Cambridge after he left. Both my parents judged people solely on how they spoke, dressed, and, most importantly to them, their wealth and breeding. Loyally and blindly, and because she'd been indulged all her own life as a young girl at Alphen in the Cape, with a spoilt upbringing, Mum agreed with all his decisions and opinions. Backgrounds such as the correct private education and how people they met earned their living would be weighed against whether they were old or new money. Acquaintances were ruled out on the strength of their table manners, whether they said pleased to meet you instead of the more correct, in their view, how do you do. Some people were arrogantly dismissed simply because they had the wrong accent or held a knife incorrectly. Like a pencil, scorned Mum, and deemed them socially unacceptable. Wealthy people were allowed to break the rules, as, for example, in the case of beards. Dad hated beards on men, saying they looked scruffy, and he called them beatniks. But when Harry Oppenheimer's son grew a beard, it was considered distinguished. Similarly, a very rich friend of theirs, a widow, was overweight and wore too much makeup. Normally she would have been vilified by my parents, but they fawned around her and made a weekly phone call to her to chat, something they hardly ever did with their own family members. Dad despised Afrikaner, called them Boets, and refused on principle to learn a word of their language, although he spoke Zulu fluently. He disliked the Afrikaner nationalist government, but he also hated and despised English-speaking white liberals. Because he'd spent the war bombing the Italians, he hated them as much as he hated the Germans. Together with the former, he dismissed all Europeans as Eurotrash. Unsurprisingly, he was anti-Semitic and the only Jews he would associate with were Harry Oppenheimer, who owned and controlled all the gold and diamond industries in the country, and another Jewish friend who was nearly as wealthy. Catholics were on his blacklist as well as Christians, because he scoffed at the fact that they believed in a God that he believed didn't exist. Both my parents were openly atheist, but oddly, communists were anathema to them as well. Dad could spit the word priests with alarming venom. The Chinese and other Eastern races were dismissed, and Muslims he lumped together with Arabs as disgusting and filthy. Dad had no time for the Africans. As a race, they were, in his words, useless bloody coons. And his favorite expression was, "At least they're not running the country," although he relied on them entirely to raise his children, work the farm, and make his home comfortable. Dad didn't like Indians. He said they were all cheats, in spite of the fact that he dealt exclusively with the polite Hoosen family, who allowed him to run up a monthly account at their store, simply because it suited him not to carry cash. He also dismissed the mixed-raced coloureds with the sweeping statement, "They all drink." He would have nothing to do with what he called the common English, and labelled practically every white South African a peasant. These included all our nearest neighbours in the remote ranching community, and we were forbidden to associate with them. Naturally, this arrogance and appalling snobbery left very few people acceptable, and these were mostly our cousins or people he'd been to private school with. Not out of the top drawer, or not one of us served to dismiss everybody else. Sounds laughable and shouldn't have been taken seriously, but my parents' arrogance and bigoted attitudes were to create serious problems for us later, when we started bringing potential boyfriends home to be assessed. Dad would play 18 holes of golf twice a week with the same few selected old chums he'd played with since before the Second World War, and Mum played tennis with their wives or other carefully picked friends. But neither he nor Mum made any effort to organise any sort of social life for their daughters. Apart from the occasional visits from cousins, we were completely isolated on the ranch. Now and again we trekked our ponies across the hills to compete in a gymkhana on somebody's farm, and Mum would drive over to make sure we behaved ourselves correctly. She made us sit on a rug as far away as possible from the common children, and at the end insisted we rode home before the fun event of a barbecue and dance for all the young riders who had participated. Sorry, I should have said Bry there. As a result, we never got to know our contemporaries on the surrounding farms. Although Mum made all the decisions in our upbringing, she always used Dad as her ultimate weapon, and threatened to call him in to decide our punishment if we disobeyed her. None of us wanted to incur his wrath, so the threats worked instantly. If we'd been caught doing something wrong, we feared his cold lectures far more than the odd swipe that Mum gave us with her hairbrush, although most of the time I was out of sight and earshot playing with the Zulu children. We were absolutely forbidden to play with the Munt children on the farm, But since Mum ignored us, concentrating her whole and entire attention on her garden and leaving us to spend our young lives in the sole care of our nannies, I found it easy to slip away from Evelina every day and play with them. The children were not allowed anywhere near the house, though, and I had to shed them at the back gate when I was called to meals by Evelina. Our parents didn't mind if we spent the entire day out in the bush or the farm or the garden, out of sight and earshot with our Zulu nannies. In fact, Mum insisted we did so. The reasoning being, I think, that they didn't consider Africans as people. When Mum had her garden and her battles with the baboons, Dad had his routines. For 75 years on the farm and afterwards at their retirement home in Howick, every second of his day was accounted for. He was the only son and, as such, had been expected to take over the farm when his mother died at the onset of the Second World War. He had been thrust into the role of a rancher, although he didn't particularly like the idea of a career in farming. By 1955, I was 5 years old. Assisted by his father, our beloved grandpa, my father had increased his cattle herd to over 1,000 head, as well as running about 5,000 merino sheep. He wanted to spend less time farming and more time on the polo ground, golf course, and other gentlemanly pursuits. So he decided to employ a white farm manager before we were even born. Mr. Bannatyne was a tall, middle-aged man with a large belly and a greasy leather bush hat. A four-bedroom cottage was built for him on the farm boundary, as far away as possible and well out of sight of the homestead. And he settled in with his wife, a shapeless woman with meager stringy hair, which had once possibly been straw-colored and was now a faded off-white, tied in a sparse bun at the nape of her neck and held at the sides with tortoiseshell combs. She wore loosely knitted beige wool cardigans with pockets and sensible brown lace-up shoes with what we called lavatory heels. Those thick, chunky heels looked like the part of the loo that stands on the bathroom floor. The kind of heels that old ladies wore in the 1950s. Her teeth were large and prominent, reminding me of Chanter's, Dad's polo pony, who bit ferociously at people and horses alike. Answerable to no one, Dad's most difficult decision to make every morning was whether to go off and play golf or polo, and so, after breakfast, would have a brief meeting with his manager in the office, ring his accountant to discuss his financial affairs, and then go out to his practice polo ground, where we had already exercised his ponies. Tortor, Petrus, Shorty, and I would exercise them every day and deliver them all ready and kitted out for his practice session, with me relinquishing the job to the 3 Zulu grooms when I went to boarding school at the age of 12. I played as well, perfecting my skills in horsemanship and ball control, but was not allowed to compete in tournaments. Dad refused to consider the idea, saying, "It's not ladylike." Dad would spend the morning sitting on the front veranda with his legs propped up on a soft footstool in the sun, reading and having a tray of tea brought to him at 10:30, and exactly 12:30, because by then the sun had moved around, Dad would sit in his favorite armchair in the glassine to read the newspaper, often 2 or 3 days old, because no one had been in to collect the latest edition from the Notting Road station. One of the servants would bring in a polished silver tray of crystal glasses, slices of lemon, and ice cubes clinking gently in a silver bucket, placed alongside a waterful crystal glass jug of fresh spring water from the river. Dad would then proceed to sip his pink gin, the first of 3 that he allowed himself every day. Mum saw to it that his favourite food, a hot meat and 2 veg lunch, was served in the dining room at exactly 1:20, after which he shuffled off to his bed for an hour's snooze. Actually 2 hours. Nothing was to disturb his afternoon rest, so he'd even pull the plug out of the telephone, or the jack rather, consistently forgetting to replace the jack, leaving the farm out of contact for days. Everybody else had to keep quiet for those 2 hours as well, especially we 4 children. I'm going to leave it there and carry on next week. I want to thank John Muslane for enabling me to make these videos, and ask you please to visit my website at www.whitezulubook.com. You'll also find my videos on my autobiography, White Zulu, on my YouTube site. I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.